Well, it is so good to be here. I'm turning on the microphone. I can get on Zoom all by myself, but standing here with a microphone is a challenge. So anyway, lots of welcomes tonight. This is our first, I guess, live talk in quite a while. It's our first live talk in California. Great, really great to be here. I guess we'd like to thank Grandma Baca. Grandma Baca is now sponsoring our Science Speaks lectures for this year. It's wonderful that they're doing that. They have this incredible facility. They have rooms of various sizes. Jeff Mount is not very popular, so we have the very small. But more about him in a minute. If you want to stay on afterwards, the Cedar Pub is just down the hall. And so if you feel like something to eat, you may want to eat there. Outside, there are these cards where you can get 10%. 10% discount on a meal, which is 10% that you can give towards our seminar series. It's all good. Everybody wins. Okay, my name is Jack Plano. I am with the UC Davis Tahoe Environmental Research Center. If you want to learn more about the work we do, the research, the education, you can go to our website. Very complicated website, tahoe.ucdavis.edu. Very good. So it's all there. You can find out how to participate in our events and how to become a docent, to be a citizen science, how to get engaged in a whole range of ways. Let me give you a quick summary of what's coming up. So if those of you who really like working with kids and helping out in that kind of education, we have Science Expo at Incline High School, May 18th to 19th. Heather Figali, waving at the back, Allison Toy at the front can tell you all about that if you're interested in helping to volunteer for that. May 18th, we're here again, Warwick Vincent from University of Laval in Canada, with his PhD, Tahoe. And now he's a famous Canadian scientist. He's actually from New Zealand. He's just, anyway, he's here talking about ice and all things. We then have a virtual seminar on psychedelic drugs, because we knew if we had it in person, we didn't know who we were. So anyway, psychedelic drugs, but how they good for your health. How do you measure especially? If you're interested in more formally learning about Lake Tahoe, we have a summer session. So look at our website, June 5th, 12th, and 14th. You can interrupt your wonderful summer here and do 3 half days of learning about Lake Tahoe. And as a reward, we might take you out on a research trip, weather permitting. Brad Allen, our 34-year veteran bird captain, is retiring. But before he leaves, we're making him give us a talk. Hopefully he'll say good things about us, or he'll say good things about what he's learned 34 years. It's an amazing perspective. The lake has changed incredibly in that time. July 20th, the State of the Lake, well, I don't know who's giving that. State of the Lake talk here at Grand Lake. Okay. That's an abbreviated list. Anyway, a lot of the research we do here, a lot of the education we do here is funded by the state, by agencies, but a lot of it isn't. So to tell you a little bit more about that, I'd like to call upon Tim Koja. Tim is the chair of our advisory board. He's always giving me great advice.
the word advisory is not one that we give them advice on what science to do, although we do have some members that do that. But what my role and our board's role is actually to fill in the gaps between the funding that UC Davis and the projects and funding that they get from state and federal governments and things, because philanthropy is extremely important, because there's a lot of projects that need to be finished off or educational components that otherwise there isn't funding for. And so I'm here asking you to check your checking accounts, your savings accounts, and know that UC Davis and Turk specifically is in need of funds for all kinds of various projects. And so we have Tony is here someplace in the back right there next to, and she would be glad to visit with you afterwards. Certainly I would, also with Jeff. If there's specific interest you have, we would like to give you information on that. Thank you.
I want to tell, before I introduce Jeff, he's used to waiting. Don't feel bad. He went to UC Davis. Who knows what it's like? We have this very cool plot coming up in August. I think it's, what date is it? I think August 10th. So who's heard of the Secchi disc? Everybody. That's that round white disc we measure the clarity. Okay. Do you know how it got its name, Secchi disc? Okay, Father Angelo Secchi, Jesuit priest, started the Vatican Observatory back in 1868. Coincidentally, about the same time that the University of California was founded. Anyway, he can't be here. But the current director of the Vatican Observatory, coming to Lake Tahoe, on behalf of the Pope, he will be reading the Secchi desk at Lake Tahoe, and then coming here to Grand Labarca to talk about the science he does on astronomy and on meteorites. So that more information about that. That's going to be a wonderful. Okay, so anyway, in the 10 minutes remaining, it's a great pleasure to have Jeff now here again. So Jeff, I guess Jeff was a professor at UC Davis. He did many wonderful things. He's a geologist, geomorphologist. He likes to bash engineers. I'm an engineer, so we got on really well. And I think we spent the last 10 years of his time there having offices next to each other in the Watershed Sciences Center, which is a center that Jeff started. So if anybody knows something about water policy, about what we're doing right, about all the things we're not doing, it's Jeff. So we're all here where we've come through. Can anybody remember a winter bigger than this? Yeah, okay. Right, I'm not going to be here now. So young. So he's going to tell us not so much about the winter and how we can start shoveling, but really what this means to the state of California, what we've done right, maybe what we'll do in the future. Is that what you're going to talk about?
I think that's right.
You can cover all that?
Okay, I cover.
And more. And more. And more. Okay, so anyway, with that, it's such a pleasure to have Jeff.
Thank you, Jeffrey. Yes, we had offices next to each other, which is the Mutual Abuse Society. As you know, when Jeff left Australia and he came to the United States, the average IQ of both countries went down. It was a tragic moment. So that's a good evening. Thanks for coming. I am more than pleasantly surprised to be here, to see all of you here, and to see a lot of old friends and colleagues here. So again, I gather on a Thursday night in April in Lake Tahoe. There's not much to do except shovel snow. Okay, this is an epic year, and I'm going to disappoint you now. I am not going to talk that much about this year. I'm going to talk big picture. As I was saying to my friend Randy Dahlgren here, you know, as I got on in my career, my attention span got shorter and shorter and shorter. and I started working on policy because policy is perfect because your hair's on fire every day with policy, and it's a different fire every day. So it was perfect for a short attention span like mine. So I do want to tell you where I work. I am okay. Sorry, with your mask off, so I can't tell you to talk into the microphone. I work at the Public Policy Institute of California Water Policy Center. I left UC Davis 9 years ago to help start this program, help build this program with Ellen Hannock, who's the director and probably the smartest brain in water policy. And it's been tremendous pleasure for me to do that for these last 9 years. And I don't ever have to go to another faculty meeting again for the rest of my life. Okay, first of all, everything I'm going to talk about, I stole. I mean, we should all be honest with each other about that. Those of us who are professionals in the field, we have no original ideas. We steal and repackage everything. And there are people in this room that I have stolen stuff from. Mike Dettinger is sitting over there. I'm going to show one of his diagrams. So I just want to remind you that I also stole a lot from the archdruid himself, Peter Moyle, who is California's best fish biologist ever. Best guy to run into an entire career. Okay, so I want to remind you, this is a policy talk, not a science talk. But boy, I'm looking around the room and there's so many good people who know more than I do about the subject. We should probably do a lot of science at the end of this. So please be prepared to ask questions. I want to give you California in context and sort of my own view to the way you think about water management in California and the way we are adapting to increasing scarcity and in increasing abundance. And how can it be the same thing? But that's what's going on. I do want to do a brief review of the 3 general sectors of water use. That's water for communities, water for farms, and water for the environment. And I kind of got this good news, bad news, awful news as I go through those 3. And of course, because we're a water policy center, we say y'all ought to do this. These are some of the new policies we're going to have to tackle, particularly under changing conditions. And then I'm going to end actually on an optimistic note. I think we're actually in pretty good shape in California. We got some major challenges, okay, so years ago, I took Tamara Keith. Some of you may know Tamara Keith from NPR. I took her for a walk on the levees in the Delta, and I was like, oh my God, that's terrible. Oh, that's gonna. She said, I think I should call you Dr. Doom. I said, that's really funny. Next morning, this is Tamara Keith with NPR. I'm with Dr. Doom. From the University of California. My mother was so proud. Okay, I stole this diagram. This is from Mike Dettinger, who's sitting right here. And it was Mike who pointed out to us many years ago that we are the most when it comes to precipitation, California is the most variable climate in the United States. And Mike, I actually think it might be for all of North America when you start to look at it. And it is that annual variability, which is and I see seasonal variability. Remember, our drought starts about now. I know it doesn't seem like that, but our drought starts about now and hopefully ends sometime in October every year. And then, of course, we have these multi-year droughts and then these extraordinary Noachian deluges that come into California. And there's this extreme variability that's what we are adapted to. And I mean, everything from the plants and animals to the humans that are here, we are all adapted to this extraordinary variability. So I'm going to talk about that variability and our adaptation strategies. First and foremost, and usually what we talk about, sometimes involving a statement of ignorance, which is water wasted to the sea, is that we rely upon surface storage heavily. 40 million acre feet of surface storage in California, 1,500 dams in California. But really, there's only a few dozen dams that account for more than half of our total storage, and most of those are on the west slope of the Sierras. That other side of the hill to all of you, you insular people who probably don't get out of this basin very much. But it is this surface storage which is absolutely vital. And of course, it's also vital for us managing not just scarcity, but abundance. Because I will tell you this year, I'd be having a very different talk right now if it were not for the fact that Shasta was stone cold empty this year and basically intercepted some pretty epic runoff along with Oroville. We would be having a much more nuanced discussion today, and I'd be showing you lots of good Dr. Doom pictures. We got lucky. Oh my God, we got lucky this year on that. But I want to remind you that these dams, that they've evolved in their purposes they're put to, and basically they do 5 things, and sometimes these 5 things are in tension. And I'm not talking about our large multi-purpose dams. Obviously, water supply, and I mean, you know, when the Army Corps of Engineers told everybody, well, we're going to build Folsom Dam, and you will not have any problems with flood control for the rest of forever because we're giving you 500-year level of protection. Well, of course, that was a damnable lie. However, it was really a water supply structure. So when you hear this phrase multi-purpose, most of them, the purpose is for water supply. But we do get clean, not green, but clean generation. About 21% of our power supply comes from, or in a good year like this, will come from hydropower generation. Obviously, recreation on these things. I mean, one bass boat costs what, like $70,000, $80,000. So it's a big money maker. We are now asking these dams to do things they were never designed to do, and that is to maintain ecosystems downstream, particularly cold water temperatures for salmonids. And then, of course, as I say, we rely on them very heavily for flood risk reduction. Those are in tension. If you're running a dam and you got a water supply or hydropower objective, let's take Shasta, for example, you want a full dam, you want a full reservoir, right? If you're doing flood control, say in Sacramento, you want an empty reservoir, okay? And those two are in constant tension in our highly variable climate. But Mike has been telling, I'm sorry to pick on Mike, but the fact that he drove all the way up here from Carson City to see my talk. Mike has been telling us for years, we think about storage all wrong. And he's right. The fact is we designed our entire storage system, and I'll get to how old it is here in a second. We designed it around a seasonal snowpack. And when we got skunked so bad in 2021, 2014 and 15, et cetera, the snow disappeared. Just what was there was snow, just didn't even make it into it hardly made it into our reservoirs. So we have to think when it comes to April 1st, not how much is in our reservoirs, but how much is in our reservoirs plus snowpack. And so what I've done here is sort of plotted what a difference this year is relative to the other. And for you guys, folks who like histograms, look at the Southern Sierra and what's happened in the Southern Sierra. The Southern Sierra, I sorry, see Shorty, we overuse the word epic this year. I mean, epic has been worn out. We've run out of something beyond the adjectives of an unprecedented and epic. But the snowpack in the Sierras, your storage is all in snowpack down there. But here's what a normal year looks like. And of course, Mike kindly plotted up Lake Tahoe. So you guys, it is epic. my wife and I bought a cabin up here in 1983, which those of you who've been around a long time know that was a pretty epic year. We bought it in the summer in Kings Beach and met the neighbors who were suffering from PTSD. They just hated snow. They hated the place. They couldn't imagine. Yeah, they were fine. They're still there. So so we have to think about snowpack because we've designed an entire system of water supply and flood control around the fact that we stick roughly 30% of our water supply in snowpack in a year. And that variability is a real challenge going forward. But until 10 years ago, the forgotten storage in this system was groundwater. Groundwater, the available storage in groundwater, I have wonderful fights with my colleagues over how much it is, but it's a minimum 3 times the amount of storage that we have in surface reservoirs, and it's probably closer to 10 times the amount of surface storage we have in reservoirs. It is a huge potential reservoir, and we've been abusing it for 100 years. And this is part of the problem. And groundwater became front and center, a big issue about 10 years ago in the last, not the most recent drought, but the last drought, which, by the way, is probably all one continuous drought, and we can have an argument about that. There's more than 500 groundwater basins in California, and for the first time, we're actually starting to regulate the use of those to try and create sustainable use of those groundwaters. So groundwater is a huge deal. But the third part of this that we don't talk about much, and by the way, I'm hoping the Q&A will last until Jeff gets hungry. So stick around, or somebody gives him a big donation. So the adaptation is distribution systems, conveyance. I got to remind you, 75% of the rate of the precipitation in California falls north of Sacramento. 75% of its use is south of Sacramento. That's the big dividing line in California. And we could not exist as a state if it was not for this extraordinary distribution system, this grid. And in fact, in many ways, we operate it like an electric grid, especially where you've got trading, which I'll mention here in a second. So this is one of the world's most elaborate distribution systems. I remind you, if you're in San Diego, and for those of you who know water, you know you're always dealing with cranky people when you're dealing with people in San Diego. You pour a glass of water in San Diego, you're going to drink water from Wyoming, the western slope that drains into the Colorado system. You're going to drink water that comes all the way from the Klamath. And how does that happen? Someone drilled a tunnel through at the upper part of the Trinity River, and you're going to drink some water that came from your toilet, which is actually which is a big deal there, and because they had some bright councilman wanted to do water recycling and reuse and recycling and we'll call it toilet to tap. It'll be great. They've spent years trying to undo that stupid branding. But without this distribution system, we could not exist as this state. It's extraordinary in here. And that distribution includes flood management. Everybody is a flood manager the day after the flood, I've noticed, and everybody suddenly is all aware about how to manage floods. We have also some of the most elaborate and antiquated flood control systems imaginable. This is the design. Somebody recognizes Branciforte Creek in Santa Cruz. This was the design of the 30s. This was the idea: get the water out of here as fast as you can, line it with concrete, make it really straight. And Jeff will appreciate it. It's supercritical flow, so it goes really fast. None of that happens. These are flood machines. These are damage machines, partly because once they built these things, they put houses right up against them. And you go around LA, look all over LA. After the 1930s floods, this was the way the soulless engineers, as I call them, because Jeff's in the room, showing engineering hubris, built these concrete line channels and thought somehow they'd work. And they didn't, and they don't. And it's a huge liability, and we're facing some major challenges for that. So that distribution system includes flood management. The other is, so the fourth, okay, so the first is surface storage, groundwater storage, and then distribution systems or a grid. The fourth is basically managing demand, because we never have enough water except this year. And we have too much, right? There's no Goldilocks moment in California water ever. And in fact, I got to tell you, it must bug the hell out of you when you hear them on the news say, well, today the snowpack is 10 inches above normal. What the hell is normal? Normal is like no snow or too much snow. Nothing is normal in this system. But we are governed by what is called the modern water rights system. My wife is here tonight, and I always like to point out she was the head of water rights for the State Water Resources Control Board. In fact, we got quite the representation from the board here tonight. And she was in charge of the modern water rights system, which was started in 1913 and really get going in 1914. So it's well known to you all. It's a first in time, first in right system. If you use it or lose it, and it has. I'm happy to discuss it. It has all kinds of arcane aspects which are ripe for reform, and that's in front of the legislature right now. The legislatures consider it. The other is this burgeoning water markets and trading. We put water on very low value crops in some places when there is a tremendous need for high value crops or for cities. And so we really have started trading a lot now in California, and it's a lot of the future for managing demand. And then finally, it's everybody scolding everybody, lawn shaming, which I thought was the great part of the 2012 through 2016 drought. We took out our lawn, and if anybody's driven by our house, and planted so much more. But we did take out our lawn. So, and this is, and I'm going to tell you, we are really good at this part of the equation, the conservation and demand, managing demand. And then finally, the fifth tool, which is extremely important, is an array of environmental laws which are intended to keep us from doing harm while we do this, social and environmental harm, and in fact, economic harm to some extent. But it is a reminder to all of you, nobody in California owns water. You own the right to use that water. It is a public trust resource that the State Water Resources Control Board is to manage in a balanced way in the public interest. And that is actually a big loaded it's in the Constitution. The Constitution, it's a big, powerful stick, which doesn't get used as much as some people would like, but it's extremely important. And then there's this array of laws. I mean, you can't keep track of them. I have a very good colleague and friend named Brian Gray from what used to be called the Hastings School of Law. I think it's the University of California, San Francisco School of Law now. He is an expert on this, and he will tell you he's not an expert on it because it's pretty darn complicated. But mostly we focus on Endangered Species Act and Clean Water Act laws to basically govern it. So those are the 5 tools, the 5 primary tools. But I want to tell you, there's a caution here. All of these tools are ancient, and that's a problem. What you have is most of our reservoirs are about 75 years old or older, and most of them have a lifespan of less than 100 years as expected. We've been overdrafting groundwater for more than 100 years. So we have now a giant hole in the ground, which in some cases is causing extreme subsidence in the San Joaquin Valley. Most of our grid is 50 to 75 years old. Our modern rights system is 110 years old. And our key environmental laws, which all seem so modern, they turn 50 this year. They're going to be 50 years old. So this is ripe for modernization, and there's a good reason to be doing the modernization, and that is things are changing rapidly. And I'll get that to a second. So every time I give a talk like this, I get the question, who uses how much? And it is used as a cudgel, often depending on what your political orientation is, where you stand depends on where you sit, or however that phrase goes. PPIC just released a bunch of what we call fact sheets, and you can go right to our website and download these fact sheets. They're very short, and they try to give you who uses how much. And we break it up into 3 groups: communities, farms, and the environment, which is the sectors that I'm about to cover here for a second. You will hear in the back-to-back 2 phrases that are maddening. And the first is agriculture uses 80% of the water in California and only accounts for 2% of GDP. The environment uses half of the water in California. And how can both of these be true at the same time? Okay, and whoever said which one of those, you kind of know where they're coming from. Here's how it works. The Department of Water Resources has an accounting system which we at PPIC have been highly critical of in the past. And they did do some adjustments last time. We pointed out problems with it, but we remain very critical of the approach that they have taken. But basically, what they do is they sweep together and call environmental water an array of water that you would think of as environmental to meet endangered species needs, water that you would think of as environmental to make flow and water quality, meet flow and water quality standards for people. But wait a minute, if for farms, but it's counted against the environment, right? So most of you think of the Sacramento San Joaquin Delta. All the water that flows out of the San Joaquin, makes it out of the San Joaquin Delta, is counted as environmental water. But during a drought, almost all the water that flows out of the Delta is to keep it fresh enough so people can use it. The environment is almost meaningless during extreme drought. It goes to people, but in their accounting system, that's the way they account it. And then the part that drives me most nuts, as you can see here, more than half the environmental water is on the North Coast, where there's nobody to use it. But you will hear a politician in the San Joaquin Valley start his phrase, it's usually he, start his phrase with 50% of the water goes to the environment, and it's water wasted to the sea. Okay, so here's our fact sheet. Please try to understand that a little better. In the San Joaquin Valley, less than 30% of the water goes to the environment. Actually, it's 29%. It goes to the environment. And actually, even that's not right, because most of that comes out of the Sacramento. Farms, 90%. Well, how can that be? Well, that's 90% of the developed water. Okay, so water that is basically water that, 40% of total water, 80% of the developed water, meaning water we divert from rivers. So that's how you get both of those, but extremely variable in shape and time. I got to tell you, during a drought, the environment is a very small user of water, very small user. And we've set up a regulatory system that does it that way. During a wet period, the environment is a big user because of our accounting system. So don't be duped by that. But here's what's happening, and you all know that. You live up here. Many of you have been here for a long time. So our water management challenge, those 5 tools that I surface storage, groundwater storage, the grid conveyance, the grid management of demand, particularly our water rights system, and then finally the laws. All 5 of those tools are now being stretched to the limit because of ongoing climate change. And what we're seeing, most importantly, is we're in the era of the hot drought. Anyway, did I skip a slide? No, I did not. We've moved into the era of the hot drought, and you can see on the temperatures on this, we're not seeing a big change in long-term average precipitation. I'll explain why in a moment, but we are seeing this increased temperature-driven drought. So the hot drought. And what we're also seeing in all of this is something, again, I'm sorry to pick on Mike, but this is like, you know, steal everything you can from your colleagues when they're out of the room. When they're in the room, reminded you got that from them. Mike has been pointing out for some years, and his colleagues have been pointing out for some years, the atmosphere is changing. And the atmosphere, the thirst of the atmosphere is changing. And it is drawing water back out of the landscape. So that when precipitation falls on the land, it is not going into our rivers. It's not going into our reservoirs. It's going back into the atmosphere. So this thirst of the atmosphere is contributing to a reduction in runoff and increasing drought intensity, which is a major problem. So it's a rapid shift in conditions. And this is the plot that Mike gave me of thirst of the atmosphere. This is basically Sacramento North. And what you see here outlined in red is the all-time thirstiest year, which is 2021. 2021 broke our water supply system, our surface water supply system. It was not just dry, it was very dry. It was so dry, but we continued to use water as if it was not. And that's how it broke our water supply system. Okay, so you all are familiar with that. There's a familiar looking picture for some of you up here during the last 2 droughts. We are facing 5 climate pressures that, again, are stretching the 5 tools that we use. The top of the list, as I already mentioned, is warming temperatures, which is also translating to shrinking snowpack. By the way, when I accepted this offer to talk here, we were worried about the 4th year of drought. Now I'm worried about that glacier coming through the window into this place. So you're going to have more years like this, but shrinking snowpack. And remember, I told you that our water supply system is entirely wrapped around this notion of 30% of our supply comes from snowpack. Shorter wet seasons. This seasonality is a big deal. And it is now starting to show up in spades. And what I mean by that is fall is lasting longer and spring is coming earlier. And we're basically having to concentrate our precipitation into fewer and fewer months. So that too stresses our systems, and that's part of what's going on. Of course, the part that I'm personally most interested in particularly this year, is our increasingly volatile precipitation. So our wets are getting wetter, our dries are getting drier more intensively. And don't forget, sea level is rising and has a really big impact on coastal aquifers and the Delta, and the Sacramento San Joaquin Delta in particular. Makes it harder to keep it fresh. So this is the test, is this increasing volatility and trying to grapple with this increasing volatility. And this is what people that I know who work in this business wake up and worry about every day. I mean, as I say, your hair's on fire every day in California water, but it is this increasing volatility. This is work that we did years ago with Daniel Swain. We did some basic modeling on extreme dry years versus extreme wet years. And basically, most of the models are suggesting the kinds of things we just saw. We call it whiplash, right? So take 2020, take 2022 to 2023. We're going to see more of that. Okay, and more of that in the future, which is a big test of our system. Because I told you, everything is about 75 years old. Everything's my age or older. That's a problem. We designed it for a different climate. But let me just talk a bit about communities. We have an extraordinary capacity to adapt here in California. I would tell you a story. Every time a disaster occurs, where you have a drought or something like that, I get a call from the New York Times for a quote, and they're always looking for like, "Oh, we're all going to die." And in the last drought, the New York Times was so disappointed when I said, actually, we're adapting pretty well. What? I want to see dead people in the street because it's the New York Times. They love it when bad things happen in California. So I've disappointed them all along. But I got to point out to you guys something, which is really, really important here. Look at this. We are using the same amount of water we were using in 1990. In fact, we're using less. And the economic production, I'll talk a little bit about that in a second, of agriculture has gone up 4 times. Okay, and then in real dollars, in real today's dollars. So the economic efficiency has gone up 4 times. And we've added almost 10 million people, and we're using less water. I mean, if you take the latest data, we're using less water in the urban environments. This is our extraordinary capacity to adapt. And we sell ourselves short all the time, or at least the headlines do, about that. And we have done a remarkable job. And I think we got plenty of room to go, particularly in communities. This is not a Tahoe problem, okay? On the other side of the hill, half the water we use goes to outdoor irrigation. So urban settings have lots of room yet to adapt to decreasing supply reliability. And in fact, there's now, as you know, there's been a lot of push from the legislature to make this mandatory. I'm not sure that's a good idea. It should be done based on who's done what. One of the things we ran into in the last drought, particularly the 2012-2016 drought, is that Jerry Brown, no one in California hated lawns more than Brown. I mean, I wanted to get a bumper sticker to kill your lawn, you know, I mean, for Jerry Brown. And he just thought there's like, you know, his Jesuit upbringing, whatever, you couldn't stand lawns. But he wanted mandatory conservation measures to be the same and everywhere throughout California. We're all on this together. That was a mistake. And the mistake was there were places that made huge investments in improving their supply reliability, had already made major investments in conservation, and they were being punished the same as places like Granite Bay on the other side of the hill, where everybody's got a golf course in front of their lawn, as far as, I mean, in front of their house, as far as I can tell. So it was uneven in that regard. And they wised up in this second drought and started to make it more specific based on urban water plans. But I want to tell you, we got lots of room to adapt. So I'm not so worried about that within those communities. But we do need help. And so because this is a policy talk, here are 5 major policies that we know are going to be a problem. One of the things that's happening is as we go through conservation, more conservation, unfortunately, some communities are then using that conserved water for growth. Because, you know, we have a law that says, show me the water before you can go to the growth. So, okay, we'll get the water. We'll do it through conservation. And what that does is it hardens demand. And so that there's a great Professor Brent Haddad from Santa Cruz who said lawns are a good thing because you can turn them brown during a drought. You can dry them out and gives you flexibility. He was booed off the stage for it. But the fact of the matter is that we have to really worry about hardening demand. So we need a balance there. And we're still working on that. And I know the folks in LA are doing some really pretty innovative and exciting approaches on this. We don't work well together. Okay, there's a series of fiefdoms, and particularly in urban areas. Think how much San Francisco hates East Bay Metropolitan Utility District. I mean, they're constantly at war with each other. It is cooperation that actually is likely to work. And by the way, they're interties now, cross. It's actually pretty funny to see those guys. And that's part of the integration of water supply. One of the things that came out of the 2012-2016 drought, and certainly came out of the 2020-22 drought, diversified portfolios. Those urban areas that had diversified sources of water, no problem, made it fine through those droughts. One of the big problems we have is that my water bill is encouraging me to use less water because it saves me money. The problem is then the fact is that 80% of the cost of water are fixed costs. Okay, it's the pipes, it's the pumps, it's the people, and all the rest of that stuff. So there's a disincentive for water agencies to have that kind of rate structure. And so that's being considered by the legislature right now, is how to improve that. And then finally, I do remind you, water is getting expensive, and this is a social justice question. And if you live in a rural community, in particular, where they're overdrafting groundwater, you're really in trouble there. And so this is a major social justice question. And to the legislature's credit, they are on top of this one. This is one that they are trying to solve with money. Agriculture, I gave a talk recently to the Irrigation Institute, and I said this: the footprint of irrigated agriculture in California is shrinking. It's going to shrink dramatically over the next 20 years. And at that point, they disinvited me from the room. but we've done a tremendous amount of work on this, and it doesn't have to hurt as much as people might imagine. We are seeing climate-driven declines in supply, of course, which is key, increasing demands for environmental protection. I mean, I'm going to get to the point where our ecosystem is in pretty bad trouble. And then we have the biggest legislation, which some of you in this room were involved in, that has happened since the water rights system was set up in 1914. And that is the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. Those overdrafted basins now have until 2040, some to 2042, to come into balance. And if they don't, my wife's old organization, the State Water Resources Control Board, is going to take it over, and you're not going to like it. So it's a great incentive for them to come into balance. So they are looking at dramatic reductions in water, particularly in places like the San Joaquin Valley. So let me give you that example. There's a tendency to dismiss agriculture as only 2% of the GDP and using 80% of the water. And that's the wrong way to think about it. If you live in the San Joaquin Valley, it is extremely important to you. That's your local economy. Okay, you got to get off the statewide, thinking about it statewide. And second, agriculture requires water as a throughput. You can't grow food without water. And I used to joke, we need to get really upset with Silicon Valley because they're taking all the programmers. Well, yeah, that's a throughput for their industry. So you have to have water for agriculture. So it is extremely important, and some of our most disadvantaged communities are out there in that valley. So it is a social justice issue. We just published an analysis which suggests that they're going to see a 20% decline in available water from a combination of water supply, climate change, environmental regulations, and this having to come into sustainability because they've been overdrafting groundwater for 100 years there. That's big. That's 900,000 acres of fallow land. And what do? So we then did, of course, because we're PPIC, we did then a complex economic analysis that showed if you all got in, you all could just get along and trade water with each other, you could really soften the blow. In fact, we actually came up with a way to make it zero economic impact. So priorities for thriving agriculture in the future are going to have to be supply augmentation. And where's that augmentation? Where's the biggest reservoir in all of California? It's groundwater. It is this giant reservoir which happens to sit below most of our farm areas. They're going to have to put water, do a better job, and that will reduce fallowing by about a quarter. Okay, there's not that much water that you're going to be able to do that. Surface water trading surface water really helps and reduces the economic impacts. Thanks to UC Davis, and I mean this, thanks to UC Davis, there have been just so many advances in the productivity of crops, literally using less water to grow specific crops, and the growth that will reduce land fallowing. But it is regional cooperation. I'm going to go down to San Joaquin and give a talk next week, and I'm going to start from my 20-year memory of going down to the San Joaquin when I was on the flood board before I was fired with enthusiasm by Arnold Schwarzenegger. Yeah, I was terminated by the Terminator. When I went down there, the staff said, "Oh man, the only thing they hate more than each other down there is government." And they were right. So the problem facing places like that is they have a long history of fighting with each other. And if you've been watching what's going on in Tulare Lake Basin, you know that's a prime example of the kind of fighting. Regional cooperation is going to be essential. You've got to start trading water and moving water around in that system to reduce the economic costs. I can safely say they are now starting to realize that and making progress in there. Agriculture is important to California. It's really important. It's important to the world. And so we really have to pay attention to this. Now, the less sanguine view I'm going to give you is on the environment. Although I noticed that Tahoe is more blue, which is great news. We always like to hear that. It is the third leg of the management stool, but not treated that way. Biodiversity decline, I've got people in this room who know this better than I do, is just continuing. Despite our best efforts, we're seeing a significant decline, and it's not just fish. Okay, it's bugs, birds, and bunnies, and it's across the board. We're seeing this biodiversity decline. And what I'm going to say to you now is a wild ass hypothesis. I think what's happening is we're beating the drought resilience out of these species. And I'll show you an example of this. And then finally, the last thing, when I deal with water in and out and we talk about the environment is always treated as a constraint rather than a priority. And I can give you plenty of evidence for how that works, both in the way the Bureau of Reclamation and the Department of Water Resources operates. They have this attitude of, let's just use all the water we can without breaking the law. That's their attitude. And that's a quote from the former head of the Bureau of Reclamation. So we're going to use all the water we can without breaking the law. And that's a constraint. And I think that's part of the problem but I want to show you some pictures of fish because I'm a Peter Moyle acolyte. Let me give you an example. There are 3 strategies that fish use to basically deal with drought. Avoid it. The best one is the Chinook salmon, because more than half their population is at sea during a drought. While it's bad on shore, you hope that it's good offshore, and they're doing okay in that drought. That's avoidance. There is resistance. This unloved animal here, the Sacramento sucker, is actually doing fine as a species. It has all these physiological adaptations to dealing with the stress of drought, low oxygen, high temperatures, for example. And then there's recovery. The Sacramento splittail is one of my all-time favorite fish because many years ago, Shorty's probably heard this story, many years ago, when Peter Moyle and I were starting to work on the Cosumnes floodplain, we were standing out on the floodplain and in our waders, and we were talking about, connections to the floodplain and everything. And Peter goes, holy shit, there's 1 million fish out here. Next thing I know, he's scooping up fish all over the place, and he got one of these. And he said, let me tell you about this fish. The way it deals with drought is that it lives a very long time. And at the moment there's water on the floodplain, it runs out there and he said, there's mad sex all over the floodplain, and they spawn and they leave their eggs on bushes on the floodplains. This is a great fish. And so we all fell in love with splittail on that day. And you're right, splittail populations boom and bust based on flooding on floodplains. So Yola Bypass is now a great place for splittail. So we have beat those out of those fish, because everything we do works against those 3 strategies. Okay, so avoidance, resistance, and recovery. We've disconnected all our rivers. We disconnect them longitudinally, laterally, and vertically through groundwater pumping. We homogenize their hydrograph, what we call a flatline hydrograph, that variability in hydrographs is absolutely essential because it's hues. We have degraded the water quality, too hot, too cold, too many nutrients, and we have lots of guest species now in California. The reason the Delta looks like, the species in the Delta look like a lake in southern Arkansas is because the Delta has become a lake in southern Arkansas. So we make perfect habitat for guest species in all of this. And one of the big scary things is loss of genetic diversity. Hatcheries, the way we run hatcheries over the year for production has basically eliminated genetic diversity in many species. And that genetic diversity is absolutely essential for dealing with coping with drought. So how do we make the environment a priority? I just gave a talk this morning, gave a talk yesterday about how to move from constraint to priority. And the way you're going to have to do it is you're all going to have to start granting the environment assets. Give the environment a water right. I asked my wife this years ago. She said, are you out of your mind? But we're still making progress on this. Make it function like a water right so you can flexibly manage it. Improve efficiency. Habitat restoration, where we're making investments that reconnect water and land, turned out to be, it absolutely maximizes the efficiency of water set aside for the environment. And we need planning. I need this. I know this sounds dumb. Eisenhower was right. Plans don't matter. Planning matters. We don't have plans for we don't really have a viable plan for how to deal with native biodiversity, particularly under rapidly changing climate. So instead, what we get is ad hoc moments with people with buckets trying to scoop fish that are trapped in drying streams and take them somewhere else. And my fish biologists say that's terrible. They shouldn't do that because wherever they're taking them to is already pretty stressed. And now you're adding a bunch of fish there. So we don't even have watering plants. And so that's a fair criticism of our government for that. So finally, years like this are going to be, you're probably going to slit your wrists if you have another year like this, but years like this are coming. What is so unique about this year, by the way, our dozen big atmospheric rivers, including some really juicy ones that went into the southern Sierras, they were cold. And in fact, I asked Mike, right there, are we missing something here? Is this actually what the future looks like? And he said, absolutely not. but it's perfectly clear because it is warming and we're going to see warming. But what we're seeing is juiced up atmospheric rivers with the capacity to dump a lot of precipitation on California. We have got to do a better job to deal with this increasing drought intensity of storing water in these wet periods. Because we've had 3 wet periods in the last decade, a little more than a decade. But you notice I haven't said we need to build dams. It's groundwater. That's the future. We're going to look back on the 20th century as the hydraulic era where we built gazillions of dams and the federal government paid for most of them. We are going to look at the 21st century as the groundwater century. And so it is getting that water into the ground. It is the most economically efficient way to go. It's the most environmentally benign, and it's probably the best overall, particularly for agriculture, our biggest water user. So we have got to do a better job with that. But I want to just remind you, even though we have been drought obsessed these last 10 years, and we are drought obsessed, droughts don't have that big of an economic impact. First of all, I want to remind you that during the 2012-2016 drought, which had in it the 3 driest, warmest years in history, which turned around and we had just again the 3 driest, warmest. We're running out of epic and all the rest of those terms, right? It had 0 effect on the GDP of California. You can't demonstrate the economic effect on California, but I can tell you what does have an economic effect: floods. We are already up to $5 to $7 billion in economic damages this year, and this was a vanilla flood year. Now, if you're in the Tulare Basin, you're going to have a very different view of this, of all of this, because it hasn't arrived yet. We're going to have a slow rolling natural disaster that begins next week, really starts next week, and lasts through to late June. But even then, it's not going to be on the order of another billion or more in damages, even though there's going to be a lake there for 2 years. We can talk about that in the Q&A. And then there is this nasty flood that happened in 1861 and 62. And for all of us who've been involved in water over the years, that always just sits out there, this sort of niggling reminder, this is what we can do here. And that increasing volatility graph that I showed you, that Daniel Swain's thing, and Mike and others have all sort of looked at this, the probability of that flood happening is now by 2050, 2150, sorry, 2050. The probability of that happening by 2050 is greater than it not happening. Okay, so you've kind of flipped on the 50-50 and you're over on the wrong side of the odds. Were that flood to occur today, it would be $1 trillion worth of damages and perhaps as much as 10,000 lost lives. So this is why we got to pay attention to flood control. And I've spent a career looking at this issue. And the problem is, the most biggest problem with flood control, flood management is, one, it's an orphan. We don't have a steady stream of fund. Hardly anybody pays, when you pay your utility bill, you're paying for water, right? And that's paying for the pipes and the people and everything else. You don't get a utility bill for your flood management, okay? Except in places where they have levy fees in districts. So, and we've set up this Proposition 218, which makes it almost impossible for local communities to raise fees, to impose fees for flood control, because that proposition requires that you show numerically the benefit to each individual person. Flood control doesn't work like that. It's a big, complicated system. So it is a fiscal orphan that has really been a problem, and will someday cause us a whole lot of anxiety. I mean, look at what happened in '97. That was we had 22 levee failures in the Central Valley, killed 9 people. And in those days, that would be about $7 to $8 billion worth of damage in that one flood. So I just think this is the one that's been left out. And the second is, it's part of our volatility equation, and we need to start integrating it in water supply management. And that's hard to do. They're doing really advanced stuff in the LA Basin right now on trying to use these bigger floods to basically set aside some water. But this is the one that worries me the most. It's the one, I mean, my hair's on fire all the time. That's why I have so little left. It's the one that worries me the most, and we are not paying sufficient attention to it. Although Gavin Newsom did go stand out at the edge of Tulare Lake yesterday. That's what governors do. I got good news. Here's the good news. There's a buttload of money out there. So that period of COVID excess and spending excess that we had resulted in a lot of money that's floating around. Now I know that the May revise is coming from the governor, and there's going to some of it's going to be clawed back. But you know, just for floods alone, there's at least $700 million in the state budget. That, by the way, is half what we should be spending every year on floods. PPIC report we did some years ago showed we need to spend about 1.4 billion per year on flood management on this, but it's a start. It's an important start, and there's about equal amount of money in the bipartisan, the so-called bipartisan infrastructure bill. So we're flush with cash. We just don't have the projects to do it, and there are lots of people want those projects outside of the state for the federal money. But still, it remains a fiscal orphan. You can't live off of bonds. You need to be able to have some kind of continuous support. So that is my Dr. Doom part of this talk. I think we're going to be fine when it comes to water supply. I mean that. I really think we're going to be fine. We show extraordinary capacity to adapt. We have these 5 tools. People are trying to modernize all those tools as we speak and adapt to this increasing drought intensity. There's deep interest in trying to do a better job with wet year management, and we're kind of in the chaos phase of that. We're trying to figure it, groundwater recharge being at the top of that. I really think we're going to be fine. And it's just floods that scare me. That's the part that scares me the most is basically floods and the flood damage. Scares me. The second thing is, and I'll say it again, we really need a rethinking of how we think about the environment, especially with rapid change, rapid warming and drought intensification. We need another approach to the environment, because what we're working is we're nibbling around the edges. More water for fish is not likely to solve the problem. We're really going to have to do another approach to dealing with the environment. And with that, thank you for wasting your evening with me. And I got bring them on. I want all the questions. You first. You were taking pictures of my slides. And if anybody wants the slides, email me. Oh yeah.
I'll give you credit.
Okay, later. And if I'm in the room, you really better give them credit. Yeah.
Groundwater preservation. Currently, I know in Monterey County, a lot of the farm wells are being flooded by seawater.
Right.
And one of the resolutions going on right now is to pump that well with concrete. And up here, and probably lots of reservoirs anticipating this next season of melt, are releasing water prematurely from these reservoirs in order to make room for what's coming.
Yep.
And I'm wondering if your brilliant minds are, well, come on, you are.
Not me.
Present company.
That's right.
Are thinking about ways in which to take that water that is being released intentionally to receive future water and putting that into those wells rather than filling them with concrete to stop that seawater, infusion. And I guess the first question is, would pumping it into those wells push the seawater back in any way?
Okay, so that's a multi-layered question, and I want to get to the first part of it. We have to be releasing water out of our reservoirs right now, because in flood management, rule number 1 is do not lose the dam. I mean, that's it. Everything else. So the Army Corps sets what are called rule curves, or the operation manual. And they say when you get in danger of that, you've got to start releasing to make space so that you don't have water over the top of the dam and then you lose the dam. And that's there's 90 dams in California which are considered high-risk dams. And the reason they're high-risk dams is that a lot of people die if they fail. So rule number 1, they will always be doing that. Rule number 2 is if you are smart about it, you do what's called conjunctive use. When you are doing those drawdowns, those releases, and by the way, we do that in the fall. So next fall, we will have too much water in our reservoirs and it's going to kill people. You've got to let that water go out of those reservoirs because you got to make space for floods. This only happens after a wet year like this. You got to have some place to put it. So the concept of conjunctive use, which is really taking hold, is the idea that when you go to draw that dam down, You deliver that water to areas where you can soak the water into the ground and get it back into groundwater. So that's going on as we speak. In Monterey, it's a different kettle of fish. The volume of water in the subsurface there, which is now brackish because you're mixing fresh water and seawater, is immense compared to the amount of water you could stuff down one of those pipes. And so you could go and pump to your heart's content, and all it'll do is go out and mix with this huge amount of water, and you would have wasted a lot of energy and probably wasted a lot of water. And in Monterey, as you know, I mean, it's much more complicated than that because they have very limited sources of supply. Those are cranky people when it comes to dealing with water. And they're proposing a desal plant, and then they're fighting about it because, by the way, Mark Twain did not say whiskey's for drinking and water's for fighting, but he should have. He should have. So that's going on there. So that won't work there. The best way to get water into the ground is have places where you can spread it out and let it soak in and connect to the aquifer. And there are bunches of those places all over. Actually, Shorty, there were others before you.
There's so much for a very informative talk. And with Rome, we can vote. We can contribute. But a lot more people with kind of expertise that you have developed and needed. Can you say something about the kind of the talent pool that is needed, the talent pipeline that is needed in order to create a sustainable future?
Thank you for that question. May I recommend donations to the Tahoe Environmental Research Center? I just got dinner. But actually, yes. And I am deeply partisan on this, not Democrat, Republican, but deeply partisan because I am a recovering professor from UC Davis. I taught there 35 years, and I couldn't stand the faculty meetings and went off and did something else. But I worked with Jeff. Let me start where your talent pool comes from. It was our students. And I got to tell you, the number of times Jeff and I run into our students out in the wild, when we meet them in the wild, it is so gratifying because what do? We wrote papers. Who cares? On your deathbed, are you going to say, if only I'd written one more manuscript? No, but what you will remember is those students. So that is that education pipeline. And it isn't just UC Davis, it isn't just University of California, it's everywhere. It's community colleges, getting all the way into high school. So that is that pipeline of talent, which is extremely important. And I know I was not paid to say that, but it is, of all my career and all my time in working in the university, it is those students, many of whom I keep in touch with, and I'm proud of the stuff that they're doing and realizing they are that talent pool you want, number one. Number two, and I know this is going to sound awful, but we try to do this a lot, is educating the legislature. Most legislators haven't, you talk about short attention spans, they have not the ability to get into the nuts and bolts of this, but their staff do. And that's where we find the most progress, both at the federal level and the state level. I have been working with one of Feinstein's people forever. Since I first got involved in water, and it is great. He brings stuff to me, I bring stuff to him. We go up regularly and so do folks from UC Davis all the time, as well as other colleges, spend time with the legislature. That's where the other talent pool is, because they're the ones who write the bills. They're the ones who tell the legislator what to do. And then finally, nothing beats political pressure. Governors tend to do the right thing when they get enough pressure. So I'm all about remaining very active and activist in water in particular. But is your talent pool comes right out of your universities, and that's where you got it. Because as you can tell, it takes a lot. It's a complicated subject. So Jeff did not pay me to do that. There was a question over here.
Yeah, you mentioned besides that, using nature-based. I like that. Then you mentioned the surface storage versus groundwater, and you'd be better off with groundwater. So is that one of the nature?
Oh, I'm going to give you a classic nature-based solution, which is being pushed real hard right now. And that is, remember that picture I showed you of those levees that are right along a river? Just outside those levees is, in some places, not everywhere, is fabulous groundwater recharge areas. Yet those levees are inadequate to manage your floods. So one of the most common things that are being proposed, and is happening in places in the Mississippi, and is actually happening here in California, is to start create floodways that look like the YOLO bypass. Okay, floodways which can accommodate higher flows, but also contribute to groundwater recharge. And oh, by the way, these are the most productive ecosystems and most productive freshwater ecosystems anywhere. Once you start opening these things up, you all know about baby salmon rearing on the floodplain. I mean, you know, this was Peter Moyle, and it was his Holy Moses moment when we were looking at there. And then later, one of my students, who Jeff knows very well, and so does Randy, a guy named Carson Jeffries. I mean, just super eager undergraduate comes along and says, I want to squeeze fish for a living. And so Peter and I supervised him, and he did the first experiment where he took baby salmon and he put them in a cage, stuck some on the river, so some right on the edge of the river, stuck some out on the floodplain, and then measured their growth rates. And the ones on the floodplain grew 3 to 4 times faster than the ones in the river because they had so much to eat. And as he then went on to do his PhD on this and showed some remarkable effects of this, now we actually have the geochemical evidence, and then that's a long description. I mean, it's involving their eyeballs and their ears of these fish that demonstrates the ones that get out on the floodplain and fatten up on the floodplain are packing their lunch for a ride all the way out through the Golden Gate Bridge, and they're much more likely to return. Instead of these scrawny, genetically homogeneous hatchery fish that we're hoping will come back, these fish that have more like a wild life are the ones that are coming back, and they're the ones spawning.
Getting rid of more dams because there's been
Yes.
studies on that.
Yep.
Okay, and the third one is bringing back beavers.
Beavers. Okay. Well, okay. No, actually, this is so. Let me first on the removing dams. We have a number of bad dams in California. The Klamath dams are coming out. The next ones I hope to see come out are on the Eel River, the Upper Eel River. That's the Potter Valley project. PG&E has been, I don't know, they've thrown a tantrum or two, but apparently I think they're coming around to the idea. And then the ones on Battle Creek, I think have to come out. In Southern California, Matilahaw Dam, if it doesn't come out, an earthquake's going to take it out. It's really bad, and it's got to go. Ringe Dam down toward Malibu. That's my rogues gallery of dam. Oh, and by the way, that dam that Stanford loves so much on San Francisco Creek, it's got to go. So I always like teasing my friends, but let me get to the beavers for a second. Randy and Dahlgren and I were just talking. You know, there's more than 4,000 wet meadows in the Sierras that were absolutely essential for regulating water in this system. They are sponges. They hold a tremendous amount of water, and they let water out very slowly. Not enough to prevent a flood in Sacramento, but they're part of slowing down the movement of water through the system. And the best engineer that I know is a beaver. Sorry, Jeff. You're the second best engineer I know. And beavers are amazing, the things that they do. And so this is why beaver research over the last 10 years has just exploded. And one of my former students at Utah State, a guy named Joe Wheaton, wrote some of the most amazing papers on beaver dams and how we might actually do it artificially where we can't do beavers, but beavers do a great job. And those of you who've hiked around the Sierras and run into beavers in various places, you'll see that they're spreading out. And now they're putting them in. They're actually putting them. So I'm 100% on board with beavers until you get to the Delta. Those fragile levees, there was a levee failure 15 years ago, roughly 15 years ago, that we now have concluded was a beaver den. They'll make dens that are 6 feet in diameter, and it was inside the levee, and water just started going through it, and boom. And next thing you know, well, it was more than 15 years ago, Arnold Schwarzenegger is flying in his helicopter saying, "Fantastic, we'll fix it." It's a big mistake. So they're very worried about beavers, and as you know, the super beaver is down there, Nutria. I mean, it's not a beaver, but it's a member of the rodent family. It's this invasive species with orange teeth, which is huge. And it's starting to tear apart the levees down there. So I'm all for beavers up here, not down there.
So I have 2 questions. One is trying to recharge the aquifers underneath the Central Valley. My understanding is where there's been a lot of subsidence, that it kind of scorched and it won't come back. And then the other part of my question is,
you talk about fallowing, but there seems to be this huge conversion to perennial crops.
Yes.
That's what's happening.
Okay.
I understand there's a lot of nut trees at the bottom of Tulare.
No, okay. So, great. So let me clean up your observations on that. Okay, that's okay. First of all, what Shorty is referring to is the fact that we have been doing some epic terraforming in the San Joaquin Valley in particular, but it's also now happening in the Sacramento Valley. By overpumping groundwater, we're causing land subsidence. And what happens is when you dewater the sediment that's below, it turns out that the water itself is, the pore pressure of the water is helping keep the sediment from compacting. When you dewater it, the sediment compacts. And when it does, of course, the land above comes down with it. Here's the difference, though, and if Graham Fogg were here, we'd spend the next hour arguing about the details. Most of that compaction is taking place in the clay-rich layers, okay, which are not good aquifer layers. So we are not destroying our aquifers. We are reducing the amount of sediment that can be saturated with water, but it's not the kind of water we regularly pull out of the ground. That's mostly in the sands and in the silts, okay, and just to remind you, there's 40,000 feet of sediment in parts of the Central Valley. So there's quite a deep column of sediment. So it turns out its overall effect on the aquifer is probably not what we thought a few years ago when we were panicking about this. And now, you know, cooler heads prevail and they say, yeah, it's definitely reducing, but it's not like more than 10% kind of levels. So that's the first one there on the cleanup. What was it? Remind me what the second one was? Oh, perennial crops. You're right. Okay, so here's the problem. We're proposing that in the San Joaquin Valley, they will have to fallow as many as 900,000 acres of productive farmland, and I'm using that production with quotes, productive farmland in that basin in order to meet the sustainability requirements of the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. That's a lot of lands, okay? But they've got to reduce their water use by a minimum of 13% from groundwater pumping. Okay, you could do it smart, or you could do it not smart. Smart says that you want to continue to grow crops that you can fallow during dry years. Row crops, for example, tomatoes, you can fallow them during a dry year. Cotton, we're still growing cotton down there, and you can fallow it in a dry year. So that ability to have some flexibility so that you can keep your perennials going during a drought. Regrettably, we're not doing it that way. Farmer after farmer after farmer has recognized that the profit is in the nut trees, whether it's pistachios or walnuts also are in there, and almonds. And you get a higher economic return on investment of water, but you have very high capital costs associated with it. It is expensive to put in an orchard. They don't yield for a minimum of 3 years, and then they die after 25. So what we're seeing is, unfortunately, the hardening of demand in some areas by planting perennial crops. Now, despite what the news people say, turns out the bottom of the Tulare Lake Basin is not a good place for nut trees, so there's not a lot of them. There are some vineyards, and then there are some nut trees, but we're not talking more than 10% of the acreage, and they will not survive because it'll be 2 years of water on them, and that'll bring it on. I talked to guys down there who said, "Oh, I guess this is the dirty little secret." If you haven't heard a lot of yelling this year about perennial crops from the perennial crop people, here's what happened. That nasty winter, do you know that March was in the Sacramento Valley was the second coldest in recorded history? And you guys probably thought it was the coldest in recorded history. And statewide, it was the 4th coldest. Well, it just knocked all the blossoms off the rain, and it knocked all the blossoms off the almond trees. So it's a disaster for the almond industry. And then there's this flooding and everything else. And it turns out that's good. Why would it be good? Because we have flooded the market with almonds and the price is going down, and people are finally starting to lose money on almonds. So what are they doing this year? Crop insurance. It's a great bargain, one way or the other. So we're going to see shrinking of agriculture, and probably we're going to see a lot of water trading that goes from people who will fallow during dry periods and then get water to those perennial crops. The place I worry the most about this is along the Sacramento River, because those trees that are along the Sacramento River, people are sinking wells to basically irrigate them. And if you know anything about Sacramento River, that river is directly connected right to those wells. So they're literally taking water out of that river instead of taking surface water.
things that you discussed. So pleased to hear about, and you've answered already a lot of the concerns I had, a lot of questions, including elevation. My sister lives in Seal Beach, she has this huge drainage channel that comes in and it contaminates you, and really have to start down for days. And it's such a lose-lose situation, rather than that water being taken into cisterns in residential or commercial parking lots, where here in the basin, we have to have all these BMPs. Well, that really should be required throughout California.
Okay, so as you know, Tahoe is quite the trailblazer on basically capturing runoff, and Jeff has explained to us we probably had it all wrong. At least he did that and made no friends when he said that. But I mean, really extraordinary efforts in the Tahoe Basin for the last 20 plus years to try and basically keep sediment out of the lake. And so I agree with you that it makes sense in some areas, not all, it's going to be some areas, to basically capture and control. And in LA, for example, and since you probably studied this, there are local ordinances now that require parking lots to take 2 inches of rainfall and have no runoff. Which, I mean, I remember when my father was alive, an architect, he was complaining bitterly about this, and it was like, tough. That's the new regulation, so that you can keep that water from running into the LA River, and then going out and making a surfer sick. Is the best way to describe it, what was happening to it. So they're starting to do that. And LA is actually now proposing big new retention basins, actually larger retention basins, just to capture runoff, but also to recycle. You know, there's a big thing, there's a thing called urban slobber. It's a perfect name. And those of you don't live where we get a lot of urban slobber, but people overwater their lawn and everything. There's water always running off urban areas. That's a lot of water. Orange County loves urban slobber because they capture it at Prado Dam, they recycle it, put it into groundwater, and then they pump it. They don't tell people you're drinking urban slobber, obviously, but they clean it up, they treat it and clean it up. When I talk to San Francisco people and Northern California people who are always so holier than thou on the water thing, because, you know, per capita use in San Francisco is some of the lowest, because they got no place to put the water, and now nobody lives there apparently. So, but in Southern California, the most innovative things are happening in reuse and recycling. I mean, of course, they have the biggest desal plant. Talk about desal if you like. And it's really interesting, but nothing changes overnight in water. It's always incremental.
Is very important, which is the community particular. So you mentioned your father. My father was on the Eastern Municipal Water Board for 8 years. So, so he was there in Colorado, and fenced the whole ground, started bringing water to in Colorado River. But my mother and my father both ended up suffering from Parkinson's disease.
Yeah.
Did 3 of our neighbors that were within a quarter mile of our house. I've seen the results of agricultural chemicals, and I'm very concerned in our Central Valley about the number of farmers that have been unfortunately suffering damage from chemicals. And those are still being allowed, and they're getting into our water. Our children in the Central Valley, more of them died of COVID there than other places in the country, because their organs were already compromised. And now we're talking about putting artificial chemicals in Lake Tahoe by adding aquatic herbicides rather than getting this sort of problem. I don't know if there's
Maybe that's questions for you, not me. And you have reason to be alarmed. We have a very dear friend who spent a weekend with us, and she's got Parkinson's, and she is 100% convinced she got it from the water that she was drinking.
13% of people in California have Parkinson's versus 6% in the US now.
Yeah. So this is one area, even though I shoot my mouth off all the time about things I don't know anything about, this is one of those areas where I just don't know enough. But I will tell you, the state of California, and particularly the State Water Resources Control Board, with tremendous help from the federal government, is finally pushing on that direction. Of course, we're looking at PFAS, you know, these forever chemicals which are being involved. trying to find ways to clean up these, particularly these rural communities where they suffer so much from all kinds of health pressures. So I really want to compliment the state government. This started with Jerry Brown. I mean, Jerry Brown said, this is wrong. We can't do this. Water is a human right. You know, humans have a right to a clean, reliable water supply. He believed that very strongly. And that went into his administration, is held over in the Newsom administration. We are a long way from solving this problem, a long way. But I'm happy to say, I think we're pointed in the right direction. We just got a long way to go. And by the way, a lot of this money that's come up, it's going to help. It's going to help a lot. But that doesn't solve the problem. We got a long, long, long way to go.
Lake Tahoe, and they don't need to be tested. We know they work. They also mutate the weeds and make the roots stronger. So they're even more difficult. And Lars Anderson comes and says, "Oh, well, we visit along the Delta. Well, I have friends who have died of brain cancer along the Delta area."
Yeah. So you have now gone beyond my area of it. If you want to talk about water molecules, I'm all about it. But I just want to say that good people with support from the state and federal government are starting to work on this in earnest. But again, we got a long, long way to go. So, and with that, I need to wrap up because the guy with the shepherd's crook has showed up to jerk me off, to pull me off the stage. So again, thank you everybody for coming out tonight.